You get used to the methane processing smell after a while.
Something quietly disturbing lingers in a museum dedicated to a place that still exists. When a civilization builds a monument to something lost, a dead language, a burned city, a vanished way of life, there's grief in it, yes, but also a kind of honesty. The thing is gone. We are marking its passing. We are choosing not to forget. That act carries weight, and it carries dignity. But what happens when the museum comes first? New Homestead was already defining itself around Earth's memory, while Earth was still technically alive. By the time the community formalized its identity, carved out the museum, built the archive, decided that this place on Titan would be the place that remembered, the planet it was honoring was still inhabited, still fighting the politics of evacuation timetables, still producing some who insisted the magnetosphere might yet be stabilized. And yet here, on a moon of Saturn, people were already collecting, already archiving, already behaving as though the world they came from was something fragile, something that needed protecting, something that might not last. And maybe they were right. Maybe they saw something the rest of humanity wasn't ready to see yet. Or maybe they were simply the kind of people who always feel, at some deep and unspoken level, that nothing good ever stays. Either way, what they built is still standing. Hundreds of years later, on a moon of Saturn in the cold outer reaches of a solar system that humanity has long since treated as a backyard, New Homestead endures. It looks older than almost anything else out here. It feels older. The kind of old that isn't just architectural, the kind that lives in the air, in the way people move through its corridors, in the quiet reverence that settles over visitors who weren't expecting to feel anything when they landed. Walk through it long enough and you start to notice that the whole place is asking a question it doesn't quite know how to finish. The artifacts are real. The preservation is genuine. The intention behind all of it is clearly sincere. And yet something about New Homestead, something in the texture of what it has chosen to save, in the lives of the people who have dedicated themselves to its mission, suggests that preserving a memory and truly reckoning with it are two entirely different things. The question isn't whether New Homestead honors Earth. It does, devotedly, even beautifully. The question is whether honoring something is the same as understanding it, whether a monument to loss is ever really about the thing lost, or whether it's always at some level about the people doing the mourning. That is the question New Homestead holds at its center, quiet and unresolved, the way all the most important questions tend to be. Titan before memory. Titan is not a welcoming place. That's worth saying plainly, because it's easy to forget when you arrive at New Homestead, with its layered corridors and its warm interior lighting and its sense of having been lived in for generations, that the world outside its walls is one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. Titan's atmosphere is thick with nitrogen and hydrocarbon haze. Its surface temperatures hover around -179 degrees Celsius. Its lakes are filled not with water, but with liquid methane and ethane, pooling beneath an orange sky that gives sunlight the quality of something strained through amber. Saturn hangs in that sky, massive and ringed and indifferent, dominating the horizon in a way that never stops feeling slightly wrong. Too large, too close, too present for something so far from the sun. And yet, people came here early, long before grav drives made the outer planets a practical destination, before the settled systems had that name or any of the infrastructure that name implies. NASA looked at Titan and decided it was worth the effort. The moon's methane pools were the specific draw. Scientists believed that if life had ever arisen somewhere beyond Earth, Titan's thick nitrogen atmosphere and liquid hydrocarbon chemistry were among the most plausible environments to find it. The Titan astrobase, as it was first known, was completed in 2130 with that specific and serious ambition: to search for microbial life in environments that Earth biology had never encountered. The search found nothing. The xenobiology program was defunded in 2132, and for a moment the whole project looked like it might simply be abandoned. Another promising outpost that didn't survive the loss of its founding purpose. Instead, the people who had built their lives there pivoted. The astrobase shifted toward studying the techniques of off-world colonization itself, and what they learned during that period became foundational, methods that would eventually be incorporated into settlements across the settled systems. By 2185, NASA formally divested the site to its inhabitants, and the outpost that had been searching for alien life became something entirely different. New Homestead, one of the oldest continuously inhabited colonies in the settled systems. That transformation matters. New Homestead didn't begin as a memorial. It began as an outpost of scientific inquiry that outlived its original purpose and had to decide collectively what it was going to become. The choice the community made to orient itself around Earth's memory, around the people who had left the home world, around the preservation of what humanity had been, was not inevitable. It was a decision made by specific people at a specific moment, and the fact that it was made at all says something about what those people needed from the place they were building. The corridors of New Homestead carry that history in their bones. Most of the settlement is built underground, a practical necessity on a world where Titan's weather makes surface life impossible without a spacesuit, but also something that gives the settlement a particular quality of interiority. You descend into it. The corridors are layered, the older sections heavy in a way that newer construction rarely is. Not oppressive, but substantial. The walls in the deepest parts have been patched and repaired so many times that the original material is almost buried under generations of maintenance, layers of effort accumulating the way geological strata do, each one a record of someone deciding this was worth keeping. One of the most striking things you notice once independence came and the community began shaping itself is the way it encoded identity directly into names. The residents of New Homestead, those who came from Earth families, who arrived during the evacuation or descended from those who did, adopted the names of their original Earth cities as their surnames. Walk through New Homestead and you meet people carrying cities in their names. J. Montreal, Anja Seattle, Luther Atlanta, names that are in themselves a form of preservation, each one an act of refusal, a refusal to let the city it references become purely historical, a quiet insistence that the place it names still has some living claim on the person who carries it. What's remarkable is how early the preservation instinct takes hold once that identity is established. Even in the generations before Earth became fully uninhabitable, when the planet was still technically occupied, still the political center of human civilization, the people of New Homestead were already thinking about it in archival terms, already collecting objects that connected them to it, already building systems for storing and displaying and explaining earthly things to people who had been born on Titan and might never visit the homeworld. Part of this was simply practical. Distance creates a particular kind of longing. When you are months of travel away from the place your grandparents called home, that place becomes something different in the imagination, more vivid in some ways, less real in others. Objects take on significance they wouldn't have closer to the source. A photograph means more when the subject is unreachable. A song takes on a different quality when the landscape that inspired it is something you've only ever seen in pictures. This is not unique to New Homestead. Every diaspora in human history has generated some version of this phenomenon, the creation of a symbolic homeland that exists in parallel to, and sometimes in competition with, the actual place people came from. Irish communities in 19th century America, for instance, maintained a version of Ireland that was in many ways more mythologically Irish than the island itself. Cleaner in its contours, more spiritually coherent, stripped of the specific political and economic messiness that the people still living there had to navigate. The symbolic homeland is always more legible than the real one. It can be organized, curated, rendered emotionally consistent in ways that the actual place, with all its contradictions, never quite manages. New Homestead has operated on that same principle from the moment it chose its identity. The version of Earth its museum began to preserve was already slightly more organized than the real Earth, already being edited, curated, given a shape that made it possible to hold in one's mind from 200,000 miles away on a moon of Saturn. The real Earth, with its 4 centuries of ongoing political conflict and its billions of specific individuals with specific and often contradictory relationships to what their world meant. That Earth was too large and too complex to archive. What could be archived was something both less and more than the real thing. A distillation. A version cleaned up just enough to fit inside a building on Titan. But there's something in the founding identity of New Homestead, in the moment in 2018-5 when a NASA research station chose to become a living memorial instead, that can't be explained entirely by distance or practical need. Something that suggests the settlers who claimed this name and this mission were already, in some way, saying goodbye to Earth, even while it was technically still occupied, already treating it as something that existed in the past tense. You don't build a memorial around something you expect to always have access to. You build one around something you have already in some honest part of yourself. Accepted is gone. Whether that acceptance was wisdom or simply a kind of grief that arrived ahead of schedule, that's one of the things New Homestead has never quite resolved. What they chose to save. Every museum is an argument. That's not always apparent from the inside. When you're walking through a carefully arranged collection of objects, reading the accompanying descriptions, absorbing the curated presentation of a history that someone has organized for you, It can feel like neutrality, like simple preservation, like someone has merely gathered the important things and placed them where you can see them. But the choices are there, embedded in every display case, every label, every item that is present, and every item that isn't. Someone decided what mattered. Someone decided what told the right story. Someone decided which version of the thing being remembered was the one worth saving. And that decision, repeated thousands of times across every artifact in the collection, is the real argument the museum is making. New Homestead's museum is no exception. What the museum has preserved is extraordinary, in the most literal sense of the word. Objects that anywhere else in the settled systems would be the kind of thing you'd only see behind protective glass in an institution. The kind of ordinary Earth artifacts that the settlement has accumulated across generations. Household items from Earth's final centuries, geological samples, fragments of cultural production. Walking through the museum section of New Homestead is, on one level, genuinely affecting. The sheer improbability of these things surviving, traveling from Earth to Titan, being maintained across generations in an environment that would destroy them without constant intervention, remaining intact through all the upheaval that has reshaped human civilization over the past few centuries, gives every object a kind of fragile weight. You can imagine what these displays contain, and in imagining it, you're probably not far wrong. A piece of ceramic, a printed book, seeds sealed in preservation containers, dormant but alive, carrying in their compressed genetic information the template of plants that no longer grow anywhere under natural light. Whether or not those specific things are behind every case, the intention behind the collection is unmistakable. These are not abstract relics. They are specific things that existed in specific hands, in a specific world, and the specificity of them, the mundane, domestic specificity, is what makes them land so differently than the grand historical artifacts you might expect a civilization to prioritize. Because that's one of the things you notice about what New Homestead chose to save. It isn't primarily the monuments. It isn't the grand gestures of human achievement, the technological breakthroughs, the political milestones, the named events that fill the history lessons of school children across the settled systems. What the museum has prioritized, in a way that feels deliberate even if it developed organically over generations, is the texture of ordinary life, the sense of what it felt like to be a person on Earth, not what it meant to be human in the abstract, but what it was like on a Tuesday afternoon, what you touched, what you ate, what grew outside your window. This is a particular kind of nostalgia, and it's worth paying attention to. The nostalgia for the grand and historical is easy to understand. It's the longing for significance, for the feeling that the past contained something larger than the present. But the nostalgia for the ordinary is stranger, and in some ways more telling. It suggests that what the people of New Homestead are really mourning isn't Earth's accomplishments. It's Earth's texture, the specific, irreplaceable quality of being alive there, surrounded by those plants, under that sky, in a world that had been shaped by billions of years of evolution specifically calibrated to produce human beings. That's not something you can archive completely. You can save the seeds, but you cannot save the feeling of the soil they grew in. You can save the ceramic, but you cannot save the hands that shaped it, the table it sat on, the conversation that happened around it. The museum knows this. You can feel it in the slight melancholy that underlies even its most successful displays. The acknowledgement, never quite spoken, that what they are doing is better than nothing, but that better than nothing is not the same as enough. And then there are the absences, the things that weren't saved, couldn't be saved, or weren't chosen. The vast majority of Earth's biological diversity, gone and not represented here beyond fragmentary samples. The living languages that existed on Earth, hundreds of them, many of which had already been dying before Earth itself did, not preserved in any form that allows them to be spoken, rather than merely studied. The specific regional cultures, the local knowledge systems, the ways of understanding the world that didn't make it into the archive because they weren't recorded, or because the people who recorded things didn't think they were important, or because there simply wasn't enough time. Every museum is an argument. The argument New Homestead makes with its collection of seeds and ceramics and printed text and geological samples is that certain things about Earth were worth the effort of preservation. That argument is genuine, and the effort behind it is real. But what it cannot argue is that what it preserved is all of Earth, or even most of it. What survived is what certain people in certain circumstances decided to save. And that decision, like all decisions, tells you as much about the people making it as about the subject they chose to honor. The day the sky left. Earth didn't end the way civilizations usually end in the stories humanity tells itself. There was no war, no single catastrophic impact, no villain who could be named and blamed. What happened to Earth was quieter and more terrible than that. The kind of ending that comes not from a dramatic rupture, but from a slow, compounding series of decisions whose consequences no one fully understood until it was too late to undo them. The grav drive changed everything, as it was always going to. Any technology that fundamentally restructures the economics and physics of space travel is going to reshape the civilization that adopts it. And the grav drive did exactly that. It made the outer solar system accessible. It made interstellar travel theoretically possible. And it set humanity on the trajectory that would eventually produce the settled systems as they exist today. The man behind it was Dr. Victor Isa, a theoretical physicist and NASA astronaut who reverse engineered the technology from an artifact discovered on Mars in 2138. The achievement was real. The future it made possible was real. The people who celebrated it were not wrong to celebrate it. But the testing of that technology, specifically the flawed early prototypes run near Luna, Earth's own moon, between 2141 and 2149, interfered with the planet's magnetosphere in ways that no model of the time had anticipated. The magnetosphere is Earth's shield, the invisible electromagnetic field generated by the planet's rotating iron core, the thing that deflects the solar wind and prevents it from stripping away the atmosphere. In 2150, scientists announced what the data had made impossible to deny. The magnetosphere would fail completely in approximately 50 years. Earth's nations banded together to begin coordinating the largest evacuation in human history. Earth became fully uninhabitable in 2023. What the records show, and what very few people across the settled systems know, is that none of this was truly an accident. Isa had been warned. Before he began testing, he had encountered what appears to have been a version of himself from another universe. A starborn who knew exactly what pursuing this technology would cost. Isa received that warning, understood it, and chose to continue anyway. He rationalized it as acting for the greater good, as sacrificing one world to make countless others possible. It was a calculation he spent the rest of his life questioning, eventually confessing it in a private journal that only surfaces long after his death. That confession changes the moral weight of everything that followed. Because if Earth's destruction was not an unforeseen consequence, but a known trade-off, if the civilization that built itself on grav drive technology did so with at least one person understanding exactly what it was trading, then the grief at New Homestead is not just grief for an accident, it is grief for a choice. And that is a different and heavier thing to carry. The evacuation that followed was the largest organized migration in human history, and also one of its greatest failures. The announcement in 2150 triggered 50 years of increasingly desperate effort. The first colonization expedition to Alpha Centauri launched in 2156. The United Colonies formed in 2159 specifically to coordinate interstellar expansion. Colonies were built and expanded and stretched to capacity across the solar system and beyond. But the timelines of politics and logistics don't scale to match the timelines of planetary collapse. And when Earth finally became uninhabitable in 2023, only a fraction of its population had made it off-world. Billions died. The scale of that is genuinely difficult to hold, not just as a historical statistic, but as a human fact. Billions of specific people with specific lives and specific connections to specific places who did not get a seat in the evacuation, who stayed because there was nowhere to go, or because they couldn't afford the passage, or because they simply waited too long. What those evacuees brought with them is worth thinking about carefully, because it shaped the cultures of the colonies they arrived in for generations afterward. People who leave a place under duress, not by choice, not in pursuit of something, but because staying is no longer an option, bring a different relationship to their origins than voluntary emigrants do. The voluntary emigrant can romanticize what they left. They chose to go. The loss, if there is one, is abstracted by the sense of agency, the feeling that they were pursuing something rather than fleeing it. The person who evacuates has no such abstraction available. They know they didn't choose to leave. They know they are leaving because what they loved is becoming uninhabitable. And they carry that knowledge in a way that tends to make them very precise about what they lost, because the loss was never in question. The generation that arrived at New Homestead during the evacuation period brought this precision with them, and it interacted productively and sometimes painfully with the preservation culture that was already in place. The settlers who had been there for generations had built an archive around an idea of Earth. The evacuees arrived with something different: memory, actual, first-hand, specific, embodied memory of what Earth felt like from the inside. They had smelled its rain. They had grown up under its specific quality of sunlight. They had lived in its gravity, which is subtly but definitively different from Titan's, in a way that the body never quite forgets, even after years of adaptation. The collision between those two ways of knowing Earth, the archival and the embodied, is one of the formative tensions of New Homestead's middle period. The archive had organized Earth into something legible. The evacuees arrived with something more complicated and less organized, the actual, contradictory, irreducibly specific experience of having been there. And they found often that the archive didn't quite contain what they remembered, that the version of Earth it preserved was real, but incomplete in ways that felt, to people who had actually lived there, like a kind of unintentional editorial. That tension never fully resolved. It became part of the settlement's internal culture, a conversation, sometimes explicit and sometimes not, about which kind of knowing matters more, whether the archive's clarity is a virtue or a distortion, whether embodied memory, fading with each generation further from the source, is something that can be meaningfully transmitted, or whether it always degrades into something more like legend. What that timeline means for New Homestead is one of the things that makes the settlement so unusual. When the settlement became New Homestead in 2185, independent, no longer a NASA research station, finally free to define itself, the announcement about Earth's magnetosphere had already been made. Earth was technically still inhabited. People were still living there, still insisting the situation might somehow be managed, still fighting over the politics of evacuation timetables. And yet, here on Titan, a community was formalizing itself around exactly the kind of preservation mission that only makes sense when you have already accepted that the thing you're preserving is lost. In a way that's impossible to make fully comfortable, New Homestead made peace with Earth's end before most of Earth had. Not callously, not in any way that suggests indifference to the billions who would not make it out, but structurally, by choosing, at the moment of its founding as a self-governing community, to organize itself around memory rather than return. New Homestead answered a question that the rest of humanity was still arguing about: whether Earth could be saved. The answer New Homestead acted on was no, and it acted on that answer quietly and practically years before the rest of the settled systems was ready to agree. There's no comfortable way to think about that. It's possible to see it as wisdom, as an institution that understood what was happening before the broader culture was ready to admit it, and responded by doing the most useful thing available to it. It's also possible to see something else in it, the particular cruelty of watching a place you love decline slowly, with enough time to understand exactly what you're losing, but not enough agency to stop it. The settlers of New Homestead in those decades weren't just preserving artifacts. They were watching Earth die in real time, receiving news of each new threshold crossed, each new report on atmospheric pressure and magnetic field strength and population projections, all while surrounded by things they had saved because they had feared exactly this. That kind of grief doesn't resolve. It accumulates, and what it leaves behind isn't just a museum. It's a particular orientation toward loss, cautious, meticulous, never entirely at peace with the idea that anything is permanent. You can feel that orientation in New Homestead today, in the way everything is maintained beyond what strict functionality requires, in the seriousness with which its curators treat even the most fragmentary acquisitions, in the sense that haunts the whole settlement, that if you stop paying attention for even a moment, something irreplaceable might disappear. The people who stay. Most people who visit New Homestead don't stay. They come, drawn by the museum, by the history, by curiosity about one of the oldest human settlements in existence. And then they leave, back to wherever they came from, back to lives that are shaped by the present rather than the past. That's the natural rhythm of the place. It has always attracted visitors, and visitors, by definition, are people who are passing through. The people who stay are different. There's a particular type drawn to New Homestead as a permanent home, and it's not easy to describe quickly because it encompasses a range of motivations and personalities that don't reduce to a single profile. But there is something they tend to share, a relationship to the idea of loss that is more present in their daily lives than it is for most people. A willingness, sometimes a need, to live close to grief, to make their home in a place that is fundamentally organized around the acknowledgement that something essential has been lost and cannot be recovered. Among the most visible of these residents are the people who have taken on the museum's work as a vocation, individuals who have committed themselves not just to maintaining the collection, but to understanding it. Not Earth as a political entity, not Earth as a historical data set, but Earth as a living world, its ecosystems, its cultures, its geography, its regional textures, its particular quality of light. The kind of knowledge that goes beyond what you can learn from records, into something that has to be held, practiced, returned to, constantly, to remain alive. Maurice Lyon is the figure who embodies this most visibly in New Homestead today. The museum curator and community elder, he has spent years accumulating not just the artifacts, but the context around them, the stories, the cross-references, the layers of meaning that make the difference between a preserved object and a preserved experience. His journal, left on a shelf near the museum stairs, reads like the work of someone for whom visiting Earth, even the dead, sand-swept Earth of 2330, covered in silence and ancient ruins, is not tourism, but something closer to pilgrimage. He scanned the major population centers, hoping to find something living, found only sand, and then landed anyway. What he describes finding in the ruins of Hong Kong is based on how he writes about it, not what he went looking for. It's humbling, he says, and deeply depressing. But he went. He keeps going back, in the sense that his attention never leaves. The title itself is interesting. What he practices is not simply expertise, it's a vocation, a complete orientation of one's intellectual and emotional life around a subject that can never be fully known, because the living source of that knowledge no longer exists. He is not a researcher who studies Earth the way a scientist studies a specimen. He is someone who has decided at some foundational level that knowing Earth is the primary project of his life, and that this project is worth everything it costs. That incompleteness is worth examining, because it points to something complicated about the nature of the commitment these people have made. To devote yourself to knowing Earth the way Maurice Lyon does is to spend your life in intimate knowledge of a place you can never visit, at least not in any living sense. Earth still exists as a location in space. The planet is there, orbiting the sun in the position it has occupied for 4.5 billion years. But the Earth that New Homestead's curators study and mourn and preserve is no longer accessible in any meaningful sense. The surface is sand and ruin. The atmosphere that made it habitable is gone. What Maurice Lyon can visit is a ghost, and what his journal makes clear is that he visits it anyway and finds in the ruins something that the archive, for all its careful organization, cannot quite contain. So the knowledge that people like Maurice Lyon hold is the knowledge of a ghost. Comprehensive, meticulous, maintained with extraordinary care, and pointed permanently at something that can no longer be reached. There is something almost heartbreaking about that, but Maurice Lyon himself doesn't seem to frame it that way. What his journal suggests, and what you can feel in the way the museum is curated, is something closer to stewardship. The sense that knowledge, maintained carefully enough, constitutes a form of presence. That if you know a place deeply enough, something of it continues to exist in you, not literally, not as a substitute for the actual place, but as a different kind of reality that has its own value and its own meaning. Whether that's true is one of those questions that philosophy cannot answer, and lived experience can only partially address. But the people who hold that belief carry it with a quiet conviction that is difficult to argue with, and that conviction has shaped New Homestead into something more than a museum. It has made it a community organized around a particular idea of what it means to live well in the face of irrecoverable loss. The children born at New Homestead inherit this in ways that are both visible and invisible. They grow up surrounded by objects from a world they will never visit, taught by adults for whom that world is the primary subject of intellectual and emotional attention, shaped by an institutional culture that treats the past as something requiring constant, active engagement. They know what Earth's forests were called. They know the names of its oceans and the approximate depth of each one. They know the approximate lengths of the seasons in different regions, the way the light changed in different latitudes across different times of year. They know these things the way other children know the layout of their neighborhood, as foundational geography, as the basic coordinates of their understanding of what the world is. And they know always that they will never see any of it. Nostalgia as architecture. It would be easy, looking at New Homestead from the outside, to see it as a kind of prolonged failure to move on. That's the cynical reading, and it's not entirely without basis. There are ways in which New Homestead's mission has become self-reinforcing in ways that don't obviously serve the people who live there. A culture organized around loss tends, over generations, to develop systems for perpetuating that loss, not out of malice, but because the loss has become load-bearing. Remove it, and you remove the organizing principle around which the community's identity has formed. And so the grief gets institutionalized. It gets passed down not as something to be processed and gradually released, but as something to be maintained, archived, transmitted intact to the next generation. But the cynical reading, while it contains something real, misses something equally real. There is a specific thing that New Homestead is responding to, and it's not simply sentimentality. Across the settled systems, humanity's relationship to its own origins has become genuinely strange. The generations that remember Earth firsthand are long gone. The generations that knew someone who remembered Earth are themselves aging into history. What remains, for most people in the settled systems, is a relationship to Earth that is entirely mediated through records, through stories, through the kind of second-hand knowledge that accumulates when something important happened too far back for direct memory to reach. In that context, the question of what humanity lost when it lost Earth is genuinely contested. Not in the sense that anyone disputes the basic facts, the magnetosphere, the atmosphere, the evacuation, but in the sense that the meaning of those facts is something each generation has to reconstruct for itself, and each reconstruction differs from the one before it. For some people, Earth is a tragedy. For others, it is a historical data point. For others still, particularly among the younger generations in the more recently established colonies, it is simply context, the way the Big Bang is context, real and important in the abstract, not particularly present in the texture of daily life. New Homestead is, among other things, a sustained argument against that last relationship to Earth. Its entire existence is an insistence that Earth should be present in the texture of daily life, that the loss of humanity's homeworld is not context, but wound, not history, but ongoing emergency, not something to be noted and moved past, but something to be actively, constantly engaged with. Whether that argument is correct is not a question New Homestead can answer for you, but the fact that someone is making it with this much sincerity and this much sustained effort over this many generations says something important about what the settled systems has not found a way to do, because New Homestead's insistence would not carry the weight it carries if the broader culture had actually reckoned with Earth's loss. Civilizations that have genuinely processed a wound do not require monuments to keep reminding them it exists. The monuments arise precisely in the gap between what has happened and what has been honestly felt. New Homestead is that monument, and the gap it fills is wide enough to suggest that most of the settled systems is still, in one way or another, looking away. What it has not managed to face is this: the loss of Earth was not an accident that happened to humanity. It was a consequence of choices humanity made. Choices about what technologies to deploy, what risks to accept, what timelines to operate on, what warnings to weigh against what benefits. The grav drive that made the settled systems possible is the same technology that stripped Earth's magnetosphere. Those two facts exist together, and they are uncomfortable together. And the discomfort of holding them simultaneously is something that most of the settled systems has found ways to avoid, rather than confront. New Homestead does not avoid it. That's one of the things that makes the settlement unusual, and, depending on your relationship to the subject, either admirable or unbearable. The people there know where they came from. They know what it cost to get here. They know that the civilization they inhabit was built on a foundation that includes the destruction of the world that made human life possible in the first place. And they choose to live with that knowledge actively present, rather than relegated to the background where it stops being uncomfortable. The nostalgia that New Homestead embodies is not, at its core, a simple longing for the past. It is something more complex and more honest, a refusal to let the past become comfortable, a refusal to allow the story of Earth's loss to be smoothed into something that doesn't hurt, an insistence that grief, maintained carefully, can be a form of integrity, a way of being honest about what was lost and what the loss cost. That is a harder thing to sustain than it looks. Grief is not a stable emotion. It wants resolution, wants to move toward acceptance or toward action, wants to transform into something that can be integrated rather than carried indefinitely. The project of New Homestead is, in some sense, the project of refusing that transformation, of deciding that the grief for Earth should remain grief, should not be resolved into something more bearable, because the loss that produced it was real and large enough to deserve permanent acknowledgement. There is something both admirable and troubling in that project. Admirable because it represents a genuine moral seriousness about what happened. Troubling because grief that is never released has a way of becoming its own kind of cage, shaping the people who carry it in ways that may not always serve them, prioritizing the dead over the living in ways that can tip from reverence into something more constraining. The children of New Homestead will face this question in their own lives. They will have to decide what to do with the inheritance they've been given, whether to carry it forward as their parents did, whether to transform it into something new, or whether to set some of it down and build their lives around something other than loss. Those who stay will continue the archive. Those who leave will carry something of it with them, regardless. The particular quality of attention that grows up in a place organized around a world you've never seen and can never visit. Some will find that quality useful in unexpected ways. Others will spend years trying to understand why they see loss in things that other people simply see as landscape. And what they carry will continue to matter, because the question New Homestead is holding, the question of how to live honestly with irrecoverable loss, of how to remember without being consumed, of how to honor the past without letting it foreclose the future, is not a question that belongs only to one settlement on one moon of Saturn. It is the question that the entire settled systems is, in various ways and with various degrees of awareness, still trying to answer. What the monument knows. You could come to New Homestead and see it as a sad place. There's enough there to support that reading, the melancholy that lives in the archives, the particular weight that settles over the museum after closing hours, the conversations with long-term residents that tend, eventually, to circle back to absence. The feeling, persistent and quiet, that something important has been lost, and that what surrounds you, however careful and beautiful, is a substitute rather than the real thing. But spend enough time there and something shifts. Not a resolution of the sadness, that never quite happens, but a recontextualization of it. You start to understand that the sadness is not the failure of the project, but the evidence that the project is working. A museum that doesn't make you feel the weight of what it preserves has failed at its essential task. A community that isn't shaped by the magnitude of what it has committed itself to remembering has drifted away from the thing it was built to hold. The central question this place has always asked is not whether Earth can be recovered. That question has had an answer for a long time now, and the answer is no. What New Homestead keeps asking, what it cannot stop asking, what it was built in some deep structural sense to ask, is whether the loss of Earth means the loss of what Earth represented, whether the homeworld's destruction took with it something about human identity that cannot be reconstructed from records and artifacts and devoted study, whether there is a version of being human that can exist fully in the settled systems without some living connection to the world that made human beings in the first place. Most people in the settled systems have implicitly answered yes, have made peace, whether consciously or not, with the idea that humanity can flourish without Earth, that the species is defined by its adaptability rather than its origins, that the future matters more than the past. They have built civilizations on that answer, thriving, complex, interesting civilizations that contain real beauty and real meaning and real human connection. New Homestead's implicit answer is different, and the difference is not simply about sentiment. It's about what kind of continuity matters. It's about whether the cord connecting the present to the deep past, not just to human history, but to the biological and planetary history that produced human history, is something that can be cut without cost. Whether the severing of that cord, even in service of survival and progress, leaves a wound that doesn't close on its own. The settlement doesn't argue its answer loudly. It demonstrates it quietly through the specificity of what it preserves and the seriousness with which it preserves it, through the people who give their lives to knowing a world they've never touched, through the children who grow up with Earth as the organizing geography of their imagination, through the museum that is always open, always maintained, always adding to its collection with the urgency of something that understands time is not infinite. What you carry with you when you leave New Homestead, assuming you leave, is not exactly hope, and not exactly grief, and not exactly the comfort of something resolved. It's something closer to a question that has settled into your chest and is going to stay there for a while. The question of what it would mean to truly remember something, not to know about it, not to preserve evidence of it, but to actually hold it in your mind with the kind of fullness and presence that makes the loss of it feel real rather than abstract. Most of us, if we're honest, don't remember Earth that way. We have the facts. We have the history. We have the occasional artifact, the occasional record, the occasional moment when a particular quality of light or a particular scent from a preservation garden catches something involuntary in us, and we feel, briefly, the shape of what was lost. But the sustained, deliberate, inhabited memory that New Homestead practices, that's something different, something harder and rarer, and perhaps more important than it's comfortable to admit. The settlement will continue. Long after this visit, long after the current generation of curators and elders gives way to the next, long after the debates about what to save and how to save it, and what saving even means, have been had 1,000 more times. New Homestead will still be there on Titan, in its ancient corridors, under its amber sky, holding what it holds, keeping faith with something that can no longer keep faith with anything, asking the question that humanity keeps finding ways to defer. There is a particular kind of courage in that, not the loud, visible kind, not the courage of the explorer or the soldier or the visionary, the quieter kind that shows up in the daily return to something painful, in the choice, made again each morning, to live close to loss rather than at a comfortable distance from it. The stars don't remember, whatever people say. Memory is a human thing, fragile, effortful, always at risk of being undone by time or indifference or the sheer accumulating weight of everything that comes after, which is exactly why it requires, in places like New Homestead, people willing to do the work of it, to refuse forgetting not as a grand gesture, but as a daily practice, to insist quietly and persistently that what was real remains worth knowing. That insistence is not nothing. In a civilization that has lost its homeworld and learned to live with that loss, the insistence that the loss should still be felt might be the most honest thing anyone is doing. And the question it leaves you with, the one that follows you off Titan and back into the rest of the settled systems, back into your ship and your travels and your life, is whether you're doing anything like it, whether there is something you are at risk of forgetting that you cannot afford to forget, whether the distance between you and your origins has grown so comfortable that you've stopped noticing it. New Homestead doesn't answer that question for you. It simply holds the space open, keeps the light on in the archive, waits for the next visitor who arrives not quite knowing what they came for, and leaves carrying something they can't quite name. The archive is always open. The stars remember nothing. We are the only ones who can.